Cool.
So what do you all study in your PhD dissertation project and other projects?
Good question. So I'll go first. My PhD is on urbanism in Anglo-Saxon England. So it's like 8600 to 900. And I look at this particular town called Ipswich. And it's like a biography of the town, kind of, but it's also kind of trying to work out ways that towns come about. So complex causality. That's me. Bianca?
Let me see if there is there is no echo. Yay!
Hey.
Because I'm recording using that program just in case Teams doesn't want to.
Good thinking.
Because sometimes Teams just decides at the end and then he notifies us, oh yeah, we didn't record it. So.
I'm aware.
But I researched the Galatians, so it's allegedly Celtic people that migrated to Turkey in the Hellenistic. It's cool, nobody studies it, so I can say whatever I want.
And not many people studying that area in Brazil, right?
Yeah.
Actually, that reminds me of something, Gabby. We record these. What tends to happen with the recordings is they go, well, in theory, they go on our Blackboard site. So I think, I don't know if you know Blackboard or not, but it's like an internal website that only university students can use. So only they would find it. However, if you want, we would also like to put your talk on YouTube. It's our school, our department has a YouTube channel. It's entirely up to you. You don't have to do that. But if you like, you can put it on there too for you.
Okay. If it's just for me, don't do it. But if it's for folks, of course, I'm comfortable with that.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Brilliant. Okay. Awesome. Hey, Johnny. This is our first, actually, yeah, Gabby, you are, because of the boycott, which is the reason we had to postpone your presentation, you are our first speaker who is external to the university, 9 months.
Wow, really?
Yep.
So have you all went back to presential mode, or is it hybrid?
Both a little bit, because at first, during the higher days of the pandemic, we had only online, but now we've been hybrid for a while, right? Since September.
Wow. We're only going back presential mode next semester, online. So.
Welcome. So what we'll do is we'll start at 5 o'clock sharp our time. So I guess that's 2 o'clock sharp your time. And we will, I'll give a really brief spiel introducing you. And then, you can take it away. And you'll have until 3 o'clock your time.
Perfect. I confess I had trouble. I needed help to help me learn how to pronounce the name of your university. I was like, is it Leicester or is it Leicester?
It's pronounced like this, Leicester.
Yeah, my Canadian friend helped me. He taught me. Bianca's laughing because probably she knows my struggle.
Oh, yeah. Totally been there. And when I started, my supervisor was Nisha, and her name is spelled Naiose. So it's like absolutely not the way you say it.
Yeah. I struggle with that. Lace, I can't say it, So now I trained, I practiced.
Yeah, and then, oh yeah, so Gabby, at the end of the presentation, you'll have questions from people online, like you've seen at academic conferences. So people will raise their hand or they'll type a question into the chat. Typically, they've always typed their question into the chat. But we'll also have people in the live audience who will raise their hand. So if that happens, what we'll do is I'll just ask them the question. I'll repeat it to you if you can't hear them.
Okay.
The audience to hear you. But actually, the audio in here is pretty good, so I think you'll be able to hear them okay.
Perfect.
Okay. So I think we'll get started. We'll go ahead and first record. So welcome to everyone who's joining us here online and everyone who is here with us in person in the auditorium. And a big welcome to Gabby Hartemann, who is our speaker today. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Brandon Fathi. I'm a final year PhD student here in the department. This is our second Wednesday seminar of the term, but it is a very exciting seminar because it is our first seminar in 9 months to have an external speaker from someone beyond the University of Leicester. And in fact, our speaker today is joining us from all the way in Brazil. The seminars are kind of major research community event in our department. So this is a big opportunity for people from undergrads and through the postgrads and staff to come and join and learn about the exciting research going on inside our department and also beyond. Just so you know, this presentation is recorded. And to those of you who have joined us in person, you're welcome to come to the pub, Marcus Wellington, for a few drinks after the talk. So our speaker today is a really cool person. It's Gabby Hartemann, who's a PhD student in archaeology and anthropology at the Federal University of Minas Gerais. They're co-director of the Archaeological Lavinu Gangan, which is an ethnographic and archaeological project centering on African enslavement and indigenous and Afro-diaspora communities in the 19th century Guianas. Their research is interested in anti-colonial and Afrocentric archaeology, mainly in South America. They're a prolific writer. They have a recent article in the International Journal of Historical Archaeology, and they've also done some publishing in more popular sources like the online magazine Sapien. We're really excited to have you here, Gabby. If you want to share your screen, we can get your presentation underway. Take it away, Gabby Hartemann.
Thank you. Let me share my screen.
Yeah.
And you'll let me know if everyone can see that.
Yeah.
Screen?
Far so good.
Not yet. It's probably not in full screen yet. What about now?
That's great.
Okay.
Take it away, Gabby.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Brendan, for this introduction, for this invitation to participate in this event, in this Wednesday seminar at Leicester. I'm thankful for this opportunity to share with you all today, and I am sure this will be the occasion for all of us to learn a lot. First of all, I need to ask permission to my ancestors and to Orisha for the permission to speak Agu, saluting everyone who have come before me, who is there and who is yet to come, acknowledging my ancestors and the forces of the universe that are with me So hello again. The title of my presentation today is called Neither Women Nor Men, the Urgent Need for a Critical Gaze on Non-Binary Genders Erasure in Archaeological Research. So I'll start with this presentation. I'm not quite sure how long it will be, but I'm sure we'll have time for questions, and I'm excited to share with you all, members of the audience. But first of all, I want to acknowledge the amazing Brazilian and UK-based queer artist Andreora, who is responsible for this amazing visual art representing Yoruba deity Orisha Oshumare. So what I'll present today is the result of many different thoughts, concerns, and mostly feelings. I'm a transgender archaeologist. Specifically, I'm a transgender non-binary archaeologist. And for me, this position as both an archaeology and a transgender person has for a long time been, I think, accompanied by bitterness, nostalgia, and I would dare say sometimes even rage. So I will further explore these feelings during the presentation, but I want to acknowledge this at the starting point of what I'm sharing with you all. Because to me, gender is not simply an object of study. It is not even my main research interest. But to think critically about gender is a condition for my full existence in the world today. So let's start. So archaeology, for many of us, whether we have chosen this mode of knowledge as a career path or we simply enjoy learning from it, is a form of storytelling. The archaeological record provides us with ways to tell the many stories of humankind. In my specific case, as a person from the African diaspora and from a place directly impacted by colonialism and transatlantic slavery, I have been drawn to archaeology because it has always represented the possibility to tell the silent stories of my own ancestors, of my indigenous and African ancestors. So by accessing a different kind of archive that went beyond the written record, archaeology can be a way to tell the stories of more human beings than the ones responsible or present in occupying positions of power, and using the written dimension, right? But it might be one of the ways, archaeology can be one of the ways through which we understand better what it means to be human. But although archaeology as a mode of knowledge does have this amazing potential, this amazing capacity, it is also and still a science, a modern Western science. And just like other modern Western sciences, it has always been directly involved in the process of silencing some existences. Archaeology has the potential to be and has always been used as a tool serving the interests of those in position of power. It can and has participated in contemporary processes of violence and erasure through the maintaining of hegemonic structures of inequality. Yes, archaeology is a form of telling stories about humankind, but it is also the direct product of how we understand humankind and what we want it to be like. And as many archaeologists before me have already warned us, it is impossible to completely separate the interpretations we make, the narratives we create about past times from our contemporary contexts. Whose stories are we telling? How are we telling them? And whose stories are we not telling? I want to highlight here that my purpose in this presentation is not to show or prove that there were people in past times who would not fit binary notions of sex and gender as we use today in Western and Westernized societies. I know we exist, and I know we have always existed. And dare I say, my talk is also not about othering people who embody fluidity in their experiences of masculinity and femininity by restricting them to being yet again objects of study. In this case, let's try and invert the normative order of things, the order of power, the colonial order of power. And let's have those who in Western and Westernized societies are the definers, or the ones responsible for setting the norm and occupying the norm, the ones that are deemed to be normal, to be our objects of study. I want in this presentation to analyze cisgender archaeologists and the discourses they create about the past, and the discourses they create about gender and sex in the past, and the discourses they create about the sex and gender outside the binaries of man or woman and male versus female. Cisgender people, for those who are not necessarily familiar with the term, are people who identify with a gender they were assigned at birth in Westernized society, which generally is based on what is determined to be their biological sex. So what do cisgender archaeologists say about the multiplicity of lived experiences, which are today called gender, or the multiplicity of body formats, which are today called sex? Studying what cisgender archaeologists say or do not say about gender nonconforming people reveals to be important to examine the impact of archaeological narratives on the part of humanity that is called today transgender, gender nonconforming, and intersex. So overall, what are cisgender archaeologists saying about people who do not fit these categories? And what do they say about this, the binary itself? What I have noticed exploring the archaeological literature is that there is an overwhelming silence in archaeological narratives when it comes to what has also been called gender variance. It is worth mentioning, as many of you might know, that the theme of gender itself was barely touched upon by archaeology until the arrival of feminist theoretical paradigms and later on the queer theoretical paradigm. In this discipline that has been historically occupied predominantly by white cisgender men from Europe and North America. Besides the silence and the lack of research interest on non-binary genders and bodies, silence which, as Haitian historian Michel Rovre-Trouillot reminds us, silence is an exercise of power. Through silence and silencing, we produce the erasure of some stories. What we witness in most archaeological narratives written by cisgender archaeologists is a naturalization of the existence of the very concept of sex and gender in other times and spaces. There's a general understanding that these concepts are actually human universals. Also, a vast majority of narratives rely on essentializing categories that are built upon a systematic social opposition of men to the category of women. We can also witness the pervasive use of modern Western understanding of men and women in archaeological narratives, as well as the drastic absence of other social and biological possibilities than man, woman, male, and female. However, as I explored this archaeological literature, I was surprised to come across a growing number of texts which are highly critical of the binary understanding of gender and sex. Queer archaeology, building upon this previous feminist archaeology critique and building upon queer theory, as well as influenced by LGBTQI and social political movements, emerged as a pathway to disrupt the heteronormative norms present in archaeological in archaeological theories and interpretations. And the archaeological record itself, despite its numerous projections of normative, modern Western conceptions of gender, sex, and sexuality, consistently shows archaeologists that humanity is much more complex than what hegemonic interests want it to look like. North American archaeologist Barbara Voss is a notorious emblematic figure of queer archaeology, who I wanted to be represented here because of the importance of this critical approach of cis-normative paradigm within the discipline. Also, late Brazilian archaeologist Denise Chan has raised concerns regarding inherent problems in automatically assuming that gender is an existing concept in all societies studied by archaeologists. Drawing from multiple examples from traditional societies and non-Western societies, as well as scholarly research provided by non-Western scholars, such as Yoruba philosopher Ayoronke Oyewumi, Denise Chan pointed that several societies are actually organized around categories that are not sex or gender, but rather categories such as age, class, status, kinship groups, and also that people's genitalia or reproductive capacities do not always have implications in those social roles. In this case, how can archaeologists create interpretations in all times and spaces regarding men and women? Another archaeologist, British archaeologist Benjamin Alberti, also demonstrated in his analysis of late Bronze Age iconography that not only was genitalia completely absent from the imagery, it was also impossible to rely on a clear and systematic association of color coding or physical attributes or clothing conventions to attribute gender within these opposite binary notions of men and women. So there would be no opposition between men and women. Would there be men and women present in these representations he studied? And yet another emblematic cisgender archaeologist who was actually of great importance in this queer critique of archaeology is North American bioarchaeologist Pamela Geller. She raised numerous issues regarding the attribution of a biological sex to human remains. One of them is that the assigned categories to the remains, such as ambiguous female, probable female, male, and probable male, refer to the analyst's certainty and not to the spectrum of human diversity, such as intersex people, who represent today around 2% of the world population. And now other archaeologists, such as Sandra Holliman, is the only, to my knowledge, archaeologist having indigenous Two-Spirit people as a research interest. It is also worth mentioning Charisse and Geoffrey McCafferty, who study the multiplicity of genders for humans and deities in pre-colonial Mexico. Mentioning another relevant study which I encountered in archaeological literature that actually touches upon gender, what is called gender variance, is the work by another North American archaeology, Mary Wismantle, who cast a much-needed critical gaze on the elaboration of archaeological narratives, and among which is the case of the mummified Moche individual from the first millennium AD. The person who was mummified was found wearing multiple signs of royal power, such as gold war clubs or nose ornaments, which archaeology were used to witness in the graves of people who were typically assigned with a male identity and called elite men. They were called the lords. And so encountering the remains of this individual, archaeologists were surprised because the analysis of the remains assigned a female biological sex to this individual. And so the story of this person, called the Lady of Kao, is currently being told as one of a powerful woman, a high priestess or a monarch. However, as Mary Weismantel pointed, archaeologists failed to acknowledge the possibility that this person could be neither a man nor a woman. Another important example is the work by Ecuadorian archaeologist Maria Fernando Galle, who analyzed over 3,000 clay figures from pre-Hispanic Ecuador, dating as early as 3,500 BCE, and who came upon anthropomorphic representations defying typical binary gender understandings. For example, amongst the figure, there were associations of male clothing with breast or lack of breast with female clothing. So what did this mean? What did this mean for these societies? Even without knowing exactly what it was, why isn't an understanding tied to a fluidity considered a reasonable pathways in the archaeological stories, the archaeological narratives we tell about these clay figures and who made them, instead of forcibly reducing these clay figures to narratives that desperately try to make them fit binary boxes of men and women. So what does all of this mean for our contemporary societies once we come upon the kind of narratives, whether they are the overwhelming silence by cisgender archaeologists when it comes to talking about gender variance, and the few, actually the extremely few, despite being relevant, work by cisgender archaeologists who are trying to bring forward this critique of an automatic application of binary understanding of gender. What are the consequences for our contemporary societies? What do these narratives or these silences say about us as archaeologists and as human beings? If archaeology is indeed a great sort of storytelling about humankind, what does our stubborn disciplinary resistance to tell the stories of people who experience life outside of current binary understandings of sex and gender, what does it say about us? If people whose bodily and social existences are outside the binaries represent indeed a small number of people, are we still not human? Does being a numeric minority mean that our stories should not be told? Does this mean that we should not exist? My own feelings of bitterness and nostalgia, which I mentioned earlier, have to do with this. I know we exist, and I know we always have. As an archaeologist and as an anthropologist, I learned about other times and places where my existences would not be demonized, violated, and annihilated. So, for example, the Mahu in Polynesia, the Hijra in India, the Mushe in Mexico, so many humans and even divine beings, such as Yoruba deities or Shumare, which I use representations to open this presentation, or another Yoruba deity, Osain, or another West African deity, Maulisa, show us that there was always a possibility to socially and cosmically exist in fluid continuum of masculinity and femininity. How can I not feel bitter and profoundly angry when in other times and in other spaces, there would have been social spaces available for my existence, when today and here, I and others are at risk for the simple fact of wanting to go to the bathroom? When we're denied the basic rights of a name, of bodily integrity and safety. Silencing the stories about our past has serious consequences for our lives. The production of our erasure in the past gives arguments to those who do not believe we should exist in the present, who state that our existence is inhuman, abnormal, or that we are a 21st century fad, a fashion trend. Last year only, over 375 transgender people were killed in extremely violent, dehumanizing, degrading circumstances. The number of suicides for gender non-conforming youth is one of the highest possible. In Brazil, where I currently live, the year 2020 counted with 175 murders of trans and gender non-conforming people, mostly Black trans women. And in last year, 2021, it was 125. As the situation is today, it seems there is no room for us in these present times. And it seems that we have never even existed in the past. Again, for me, critically rethinking gender and sex is not simply a research interest or a purely theoretical issue. It is a matter of life and death for me and my community. So I want to tell you all a story, which is not from me. I'm invoking here the words of a colleague of mine, Violette Baudelaire Anzini. It's a beautiful sunny day in the year 2097. Some archaeologists digging up a funerary burial find a complete human skeleton whose anatomical logic is not disturbed. The bones were collected and taken to a laboratory where analyses of sexual dimorphism were performed, and the measurement found in the supraorbital torus, pelvis bones, such as a pubic emphasis, maxillary, among others, indicated that the skeleton would probably have what is conventionally called in our society a penis. Having this information constructed after the analysis, this professional affirmed that the skeleton was a man. But no, that was my body as a travesti, as a trans woman, the body of a woman with a dick, who was killed twice, at first when she left her body, and again when her skeleton, excavated years later, erroneously has her gender and her identity forgotten, made invisible, and lost, thanks to an alleged binary, biologizing, and cis-heteronormative archaeology. And what would these archaeologists have said if they had found a skeleton with a supraorbital torus and maxilla shaved, and osteological marks of osteoporosis on the skeleton? And what would they say if they found a skeleton whose measurement didn't come close to the conventional numbers as male and female? End of the story. This story originates from a scholarly article written by Brazilian archaeologist Violette Baudelaire Anzini, currently a graduate student at the National Museum of Archaeology in Rio de Janeiro. Her piece is called Lost Genders for a Transfeminist Praxis of Archaeology. It is in Portuguese, but I really recommend you all to seek and learn from Violette. It is my honor here to invoke the words of my colleague, one of the few transgender archaeologists of Brazil, to help me raise the following interrogations. What can we do as archaeologists? What can you do as cisgender people, cisgender archaeologists? We can fight for our lives, mostly through education. It is crucial and urgent that cisgender archaeologists acknowledge that the current binary understandings of gender and sex, as they are used in the archaeological discipline, are creations of colonial, modern, Western worldviews and derive from these power colonial dynamics. They need to acknowledge the fact that a lot of the present-day violence that is directed to non-binary and transgender people directly originates from colonial violence and repression. An automatic, naturalized use of these binary categories to analyze and interpret the archaeological record and to create narratives about the past participates in the ongoing colonial violence. It participates in the erasure of past and present multiple possibilities to be in the world, to exist. Modern Western notions of gender and sex, and the very concepts of gender and sex, are not human universals. Another necessary step that is to be taken by cisgender people is to support transgender, gender nonconforming, intersex political struggles and movements. We need you all to oppose the bills that further dehumanize us. We need you all to learn from transgender, gender nonconforming, and intersex knowledge, epistemologies, world perceptions. Transgender epistemologies have a lot to offer archaeological theory, maybe more than archaeological theory can actually offer transgender people. Many transgender scholars and authors have theorized about what it means to be human, embodiment, corporality, monstrosity, and possibilities outside of modern Western ontologies. Maria Fernanda Ugalde and Hugo Benavides, for example, are learning with trans feminine people through their community-based project about sexual identities in pre-Hispanic Ecuador. So they're working with traditional communities of gender nonconforming people who are based in Engabao on the coast of Ecuador in order to use their emic understandings of corporality and gender in the interpretations of clay figures, the same clay figures we have mentioned before. So they're actually learning with transgender knowledge, with transgender world perceptions. Another step that is to be taken is to make more space and fight for that space, to make more space for transgender, intersex, gender nonconforming people in the archaeological discipline. As more transgender people will be part of those who tell the stories about the past, a shift will be felt. But cisgender people need to support this presence and learn from that presence. Make transgender people feel welcome in our discipline. I'm here showing 3 graduated trans archaeology students in Brazil, a trans man, Shai Rodriguez, and 2 trans women, Violet Baudelaire, who I have quoted before, and Maria Lopes. To conclude, the work we need to be done is not about simply inserting contemporary understandings of what we have translated today and in our societies as transgender and non-binary identities in the narratives we create about past times. It's not about simply using these words to talk about the past. We just need to acknowledge that transgender, nonconforming, and intersex people have always been a part of humankind since its beginning. Other words might have been used for these existences, but nevertheless they were present. They were part of humankind. Acknowledging the very real possibility of having people outside the binaries in the archaeological record, telling our past and present stories restores our humanity. Acknowledging that the binary itself is a recent construct, is a specific construct, is a construct that is a product of colonial world perceptions, of westernized world perceptions, and not a human universal. We need to further acknowledge the political impact of archaeological narratives on the present, and our responsibility as the ones who create them. We need to acknowledge that the gender and sex binaries, as we call them today and in our times, in our spaces, are cultural constructs which are lived and negotiated in each society, time, and place. They cannot be the excuse to deny humanity to anyone. This is where I end my presentation. Thank you so much for attending. I'm looking forward to exchanging right now, open for questions. And if you'll need to contact me, you're welcome to send me an email, and I have some references which I can pass later on to Brendan if you are interested. Thank you.
I hope you're able to hear that applause, Gabby. Yeah, really exciting talk. We'll open it straight away to questions. So again, if you're online, use the raise hand feature like you know how to do, or type your question into the chat. We can also take questions from our live audience as well, please. Okay. While we wait, I can ask you a couple questions, Gabby. First, I remember that you had some of those articles on popular websites. I wonder if you can say a bit more about the work you've been doing and trying to be a bit more public facing, because your audience isn't only archaeologists, right? The important thing for you is that, I mean, this has a political, with a big P implication, right? So can you say a bit more about your work in that dimension?
Sure. Well, you know, as I mentioned briefly in the beginning of the talk, my understanding of archaeology and of science in a general way is always a form of storytelling, right? And so I feel like having the understanding that science is actually a public service, right? Is, to me, it makes me seek forms to commit to engaging with the public that is outside academia. And so many different ways. Sapiens is an amazing way, is an amazing initiative that allows us to translate academic terms to a broader audience. But I'm always telling people that this should be part of the archaeological praxis on a quotidian daily basis. You know, if you're I'm always saying, like, if you're not able to talk about your research to your family members, you're not doing it right. And so in this sense, like I said, archaeology is a form of storytelling, and to whom are we telling those stories? Whose stories are we telling? These, to me, points to the, I would even say what's the term I can use? To me, it's not necessarily a way of changing archaeological praxis to something it's not. It's something archaeological praxis should always be, you know, turning to this public dimension, this translation, this exchange, right? So I don't know if I'm actually answering your question, but Sapiens has been one way, but I'm actually doing that on the regular praxis. I'm engaging in community-based research. Yeah, and also I think one of the core anti-colonial movements all of us who are engaged with archaeology should be involved in doing implies basing our praxis on community knowledge, you know, this understanding that knowledge is not restricted to academic spaces or languages.
Yeah, that answers my question. I think that's a good answer. Thank you. Do you have any other questions from the audiences? I might have another for you, Gabby, while our audience gathers their thoughts. You mentioned, of course, that transgender has, or non-binary genders have gone by other names in the past. Mm-hmm. Do you think there ever might be a problem of using transgender as a label in the past? Like it might be kind of, I mean, this is definitely, I'm not suggesting these are kind of equal problems, but in some way universalizing the past. Obviously, again, I'm not saying that's equal to.
I understand your question. Yeah, I think I understand your question. It's a very relevant question. I think on a political dimension of it, it is, it can be strategic and intentional. But again, you know, it depends on how we bring things to in the story. You know, if I'm using this term, the term transgender, I might be erasing other names and forms of living, this gender, what we translate in Westernized languages as gender variance. And again, it comes to the understanding that there has always been a gender and sex binary in the past. You know, the term transgender exists today and in Westernized societies because there is a gender binary. You know, there are cisgender and transgender individuals today because of the gender binary that is a Western construct. And so when we talk about different societies that are not Westernized, that are not modern, and who used other understandings of human beings, and I'm using human as a strategic way of addressing to you all today, but this is not even a construct that is also to be projected onto all times and spaces. And archaeology, I would say, is mostly a question of translation. And so we need to be very intentional and strategic and political about the use of these words, of these terms, of their connotations, of, who are we in the storytelling? What is our place to be able to define and to call these existences? That's sort of the I would say the central point of this presentation as well, is for us to also remind ourselves of our humble position. This is I think the anti-colonial movement for me is one of humbleness, of being reminded that we do not know everything about other beings, about other times, about other spaces. We're trying to translate stories about many beings in one kind of language, and this kind of language is based on one kind of world perception. It is inserted in a power order, a colonial order. There are many different dimensions involved that are directly associated with the terms we choose to use when referring to such existences. So again, when I say transgender people and gender non-conforming people have always existed in past times and spaces, I'm using a political dimension to refer to you all who are inserted in this westernized time and space, who are immersed in a society that imposes a binary notion of sex and gender, and such binary being violent. I need to use these terms. But again, how can we balance this necessary political stance with a way to not erase these identities? For example, I mentioned the Hijra from India. Hijra people are Hijra people. I cannot necessarily translate Hijra as transgender, except if I'm a Hijra using this term, this translation, in a political way. It's the same for transfeminine identity in Brazil, which is referred to as travesti. Travesti is often translated as trans woman, but it's not necessarily. It's what would be considered a third gender. It's a different kind of living gender outside the man and woman binary. But such translation, has to be political and has to also have space to exist, right? And so it's always a question of balance. It's always a question of rooting our storytelling also in humbleness, in the sense of asking those interested by these definitions, how they want to be referred to as, right? That's my answer. Obviously, it's I don't have a unique answer to how things should be done. Obviously, that's how that's my stance, Yeah,
thank you for that. Actually, again, I think that was a really great answer. We still have loads of time for questions. Anyone else has any burning thoughts? Yeah, I have one over here.
I don't know if you can hear me. Brandon can probably repeat the question. My question was just about methodologically, about developing some of these, particularly, your brilliant talk, one I completely agree with, but particularly in areas where we have really patchy evidence, let's say thinking about Paleolithic societies where you have scattered of tools, very few burials, limited artistic representation, the kinds of lines of evidence that archaeologists would traditionally rely on about both gender and the traditional alternative approaches to gender. It's clearly really important to write about the multiplicity and complexity of gender in all human societies if you really eloquently argue. So what do you think might be kind of methodological routes for doing that in archaeological contexts where we're really sparse on evidence? We've got handfuls of flint tools, you know, very limited in terms of the ways in which we can flush out nuances of information that we might like to, in later periods, of richer amount of evidence.
Were you able to hear that okay, Gabby?
The end of the end, I was not really able to hear.
I mean, in brief, he's asking if you can speculate or give a stab at the dark of some methodologies that could be used for very early prehistory, where we only have very scattered evidence, and we can't have the kind of nuanced approach that we could in perhaps later prehistory or in ethnographic or colonial history a lot of times. Is that fair?
Yeah, that was just the end. I had that part. I don't know if I can give you thank you for your question and your feedback about the talk, but what I can say you right now regarding your question is I'm not gonna give you a direct answer about methodologies, because again, that's not necessarily what I intended to do with this talk. But what I definitely want to share with you all about critical reflection to how we approach archaeology has to do mainly with a basic question, which is the following. How important is talking about gender when we tell archaeological stories? How important is gender and sex when we approach human remains or when we want to tell archaeological stories? And, you know, that's a question that is, as I would say, I wrote in a different piece that it might really seem scary for cisgender archaeologists to completely abandon binary understandings of sex and gender, because it's always been such a central methodological key component of analysis. Whether we are telling stories about different times, we're always telling stories about men and women who went about and lived in this way. But what I'm questioning here is that the binary that asked us to tell stories about men and women is a modern westernized construct. And so in our modern westernized society today, how important is this binary in the stories we want to tell in the future, right? And so is the binary still something we want to maintain, knowing that it is a violent order of the world? It is a violent social component. It is a component of the world that erases other existences. And so it is not necessarily about looking at the past and trying to find non-binary genders, but looking at the past knowing that the binary gender, the gender and sex binary that we have today is a construct. It would mostly be about looking back at us today and knowing that this binary does not necessarily help us in understanding who we are and understanding, therefore, who other humans in other times were as well. I hope this helps a little bit your question.
Okay, thank you. Do we have any other questions? We have another one from the live audience. Go ahead, Jose.
Thank you very much for your presentation. I really like and I completely agree with your political commitment and with the linking that you make between queer theory and post-colonialism. My question to you is there, and I'm talking from an outsider's perspective, and I completely don't know, I know a lot of things about these topics, but is there any danger that these two, the queer theory and the post-colonialism, can be separated, and we have things like, I don't know, pink washing, or transgender communities saying we don't want to know about this society because we would not be able to live in this society? Do you see a danger of this happening?
Can you repeat the danger, the link between queer theory and the transgender community? That's where I couldn't hear really well.
Sorry. So what I mean is, do you think that there's a danger of a separation between the two, so that
post-colonial and queer theory?
Yes.
Yeah.
So that okay. A pinkwashing movement or something like that.
Thank you for your question. I would not necessarily refer to that as a danger, but as something that to me is sort of contradictory, because queer theory is rooted in a critique of a way of perceiving the world that is colonial, and at the same time, post-colonial theory, and I'm mostly engaging with decolonial and anti-colonial work, which actually which carry are part of the legacy of post-colonialism, post-colonial theory. But in this way of approaching the world, it is understood that as we critique modern Western world perceptions and colonial order, we understand that there is no one unique truth and one unique valid world perception. And so doing that, we automatically need to re-understand what it means to be a person, what it means to have a body, how is this body understood. And so in my understanding, queer theory and post-colonial, anti-colonial, and decolonial critiques automatically, in order to be coherent, in order to be, I would say, relevant for their political and theoretical purposes, need to engage one with the other. You know, to me, it's incoherent that one doesn't engage with the other. That's my perception. And so, when you talk about a danger for the transgender community, I would say that dangers already exist. You know, in the sense of we are at risk. We're daily at risk because of this colonial Western understanding of the world. The colonial violence puts many different beings at risk, you know. And so in this sense, I think queer theory and post-colonial critiques, you know, intend to change this. At some point, they merge, mainly in the political struggles of people. Then they get to academic spaces. That's where maybe they stay or remain separate for, you know, purposes that do not have to do with the political struggles. And so again, I think what we need is our movements, different movements of anti-colonial critiques that actually envision futurities where all existences are deemed as valid or not in danger. And so queer modern Western understandings of the world are, you know, the truth. That's where we need to perceive where the danger is. The danger is to maintaining the same structures of the coloniality of power that were, you know, inherent to the creation of modern Western science in the 19th century, you know.
Does that answer your question, Jose?
Yeah, if I may follow up, because I think I probably I didn't properly define what I meant with danger. What I meant with danger, probably should have said queer theory. I was more talking about transgender communities who might feel that the past the places of otherness can be places where they could actually not live. I wouldn't agree with this statement. I'm just saying, is it possible? So, for example, we have the case of Israeli gay communities talking about the Palestinians just because they say, oh, the Palestinians wouldn't allow us to live, which is completely false. But do you think that there's a danger that something like this may happen? And I'm talking mostly about Western transgender communities, obviously.
Mm-hmm. I see. I understand your point now. Yeah, you're talking about mostly the opposition between the potential opposition between one critique and the other, right? And yeah, I understood. Well, again, I understand better your question. There is obviously a danger for both purposes if both purposes are rooted in the same logic of coloniality. So when queer theory is rooted in the logic of coloniality, it is not doing in its intending purpose. And when post-colonial movements and critiques are also rooted deeply in the contradictory modern Western logic, it is incoherent as well. And so to me, both dimensions, when they remain stuck to a logic which, for example, affirms that some existences are valid and legitimate and others are not, they're reproducing the colonial modern Western logic, And so post-colonial movements should be about getting back to a world perception where there is no, I would say, annihilation of existences implied in such movement, because that's something created by the colonial order. And so we are all involved right now in direct consequences of colonialism and of this logic that is present in all of us. This is a logic of separation, of fragmentation, of establishing that certain lives are valid and others are not. The creation of what is natural and unnatural is a colonial invention. And so when both sides actually reproduce that logic, they're being incoherent. And that's where I understand the notion of danger you're invoking right here, because it has to do with being coherent with what we want to achieve. What do we want to achieve in both movements? Queer theory is about highlighting how erasing certain existences as violent is directly an incoherence, erases the validity of certain human experiences, and post-colonial critiques as well. And so again, at some point when they want to be relevant, they have to merge. One does not erase in themselves the other, but if they keep maintaining and nourishing, I would say, the coloniality logic, then did this help?
Yeah, thank you very much. That was really helpful. Thank you.
And I saw another raised hand in the live audience. Okay. Well, I'm really happy, Gabby, that you left so much time for questions because we had some good discussions here. Okay. Thank you so much, Gabby, for joining us today virtually in Leicester. I'm sure I speak for all of us when we say that we really enjoyed your presentation and your questions. As for the rest of us who are here in person, you're welcome to join us at the Marcus Wellington on London Road. We'll meet outside after the presentation and head over. But before we go, can we please have one last round of applause for Gabby Hartemann? It's a real pleasure, Gabby. Thank you so much.